Hello, you are just in time for Gatsby Chapter 5. In this lecture, I'm going to be focusing on the image, metaphor, and symbol of time. And it begins from the very first line. When I came home to West Egg that night, I was afraid for a moment that my house was on fire. 2 o'clock and the whole corner of the peninsula was blazing with light, which felt unreal on the shrubbery and made thin elongating glints upon the roadside wires. Notice we have the level of specificity. That night, we're picking up immediately on chapter 4, and it's 2 o'clock in the morning. Everything is focused on time at this point. Gatsby walks across the lawn. Your place looks like the World's Fair, I said. Does it? He turned his eyes toward it absently. I have been glancing into some of the rooms. Let's go to Coney Island, old sport, in my car. It's too late. Here, we juxtapose an attempt at spontaneity on Gatsby's part and Nick's more rational idea of it's too late. We're in the world of two different ideas of time. All of this is being set up immediately on the first page. Later, we learn, just a couple of minutes later, that Nick has made the arrangement for Daisy to come over, and he wants to know if Gatsby needs anything. He considered for a moment. Then, with reluctance, I want to get the grass cut, he said. We both looked at the grass. There was a sharp line where my ragged lawn ended and the darker, well-kept expanse of his began. I suspected that he meant my grass. A small joke there. It's kind of funny. What I want to emphasize is this initial hint at control on Gatsby's part. He wants things to look a certain way. Now we're going to start watching clocks. The day agreed upon was pouring rain. At 11 o'clock, a man in a raincoat, dragging a lawnmower, tapped at my front door and said that Mr. Gatsby had sent him over to cut my grass. Meanwhile, Nick has bought some flowers. The flowers were unnecessary, for at 2 o'clock, a greenhouse arrived from Gatsby's with innumerable receptacles to contain it. This verb contain is important because it's this idea of control as well. But notice all of this very specific time language. We're counting down almost, it seems. Gatsby starts to worry. Nobody's coming to tea. It's too late. He looked at his watch as if there was some pressing demand on his time elsewhere. I can't wait all day. Don't be silly. It's just 2 minutes to 4. Again, everything should be clear. This is very much about what time is it? Are things happening according to a specific timeline? Daisy enters and Nick undergoes what is very kind of a painful experience of awkwardness. For half a minute, there wasn't a sound. Then from the living room, I heard a sort of choking murmur and part of a laugh, followed by Daisy's voice on a clear, artificial note. I certainly am awfully glad to see you again. A pause. It endured horribly. I had nothing to do in the hall, so I went into the room. Gatsby, his hand still in his pocket, was reclining against the mantelpiece in a strained counterfeit of perfect ease, even of boredom. His head leaned back so far that it rested against the face of a defunct mantelpiece clock. And from this position, his distraught eyes stared down at Daisy, who was sitting, frightened but graceful, on the edge of a stiff chair. We've met before, muttered Gatsby. His eyes glanced momentarily at me, and his lips parted with an abortive attempt at a laugh. Luckily, the clock took this moment to tilt dangerously at the pressure of his head, whereupon he turned and caught it with trembling fingers and set it back in place. Then he sat down, rigidly, his elbow on the arm of a sofa and his chin in his hand. I'm sorry about the clock, he said. My own face now assumed a deep tropical burn. I couldn't muster up a single commonplace out of the 1,000 in my head. It's an old clock, I told them idiotically. I think we all believed for a moment that it had smashed to pieces on the floor. Notice all of this emphasis on time, the strict time of counting things down, half a minute, the larger sense of time of again, and then this heavy focus on the defunct, meaning broken, mantelpiece clock. A mantelpiece clock is a clock that's on top of the mantle, which is the kind of section that's above a fireplace that you can place things on. Everything else happens momentarily or abortive, meaning cut off early. So the idea here is some time keeps moving, the half a minute, but other things are broken, the way we measure time. That's why the clock is broken. And notice everybody's worried. Has this clock smashed to pieces? Has time been destroyed? What controls time? Why does time keep moving? These are all major themes of this chapter. Another low-key theme that I want you to notice is the idea of the artificial note in Daisy's voice next to the counterfeit that we have of Gatsby. Right there. Right? So they're both performing a certain type of behavior. And what's going to happen over the course of this chapter is they'll become increasingly comfortable in each other's presence. Nick decides to leave them alone. I walked out the back way just as Gatsby had when he had made his nervous circuit of the house half an hour before, and ran for a huge knotted tree whose massed leaves made a fabric against the rain. Once more, it was pouring, and my irregular lawn, well shaped by Gatsby's gardener, abounded in small muddy swamps and prehistoric marshes. There was nothing to look at from under the tree except Gatsby's enormous house, so I stared at it like Kant at his church steeple for half an hour. A brewer had built it in the early period craze a decade before, and there was a story that he'd agreed to pay 5 years' taxes on the neighboring cottages if the owners would have their roofs thatched with straw. Perhaps the refusal took the heart out of his plan to found a family. He went into an immediate decline. His children sold the house with the black wreath still on the door. Americans, while occasionally willing to be serfs, have always been obstinate about being peasantry. There's a debate that you can be part of about the profundity of this last sentence. Is Nick saying something very serious and important and profound about being an American, or is it just superficial? What I want to focus on are all of these different phrases of time. Nick is counting things very specifically. Things are happening again, once more. But we also have this idea of deep time, prehistoric, and then earlier time, just a decade before. Notice we learned something about Gatsby's house. The person that owned it wanted it to look a certain way. He wanted it to look as though it belonged to almost a medieval sense where people thatched their roofs with straw. To thatch a roof means to place straw on the roof instead of shingles or something more modern. And then he dies. Here, though, we have an illusion as well. And illusions, especially historical illusions like we have, are ways in which you bring the past into the present. Right? By making these references, you allude to the past and you make it relevant to the present. And the one we have here is actually the very first illusion I ever learned, which is Kant at his church steeple. Kant was a German philosopher, and it's said that every day in his small town, he took a walk at the same time. And it was so regular that people, instead of counting down their time according to the church bell ringing, which would have happened regularly, right, at noon, because you used church steeples in order to tell time, instead, the people would look for Kant to take his walk, and when he took his walk, that's when they knew what time it was. And so here we have a deep illusion that helps us think about the metaphor of time. There's Kant. Eventually, Gatsby comes up with this plan. He wants to show Daisy the house. So they all walk out on the lawn. Daisy, I love it, but I don't see how you live there all alone. Gatsby, I keep it always full of interesting people, night and day. People who do interesting things, celebrated people. Notice this emphasis of how Gatsby is trying to live his life, but also it tells us something about where Gatsby finds value. He's the type of person that defines himself by the people he surrounds himself with. He has value because the people around him are celebrated and do interesting things. This makes us question, does Gatsby himself do interesting things? Is Gatsby celebrated? Gatsby and Nick have a conversation briefly about where Gatsby's money comes from. Gatsby says, it took me just 3 years to earn the money that bought it. A little bit later, as they're walking through the house, here's what they tour. And inside, as we wandered through the Marie Antoinette music rooms and restoration salons and period bedrooms, Gatsby has turned his house into a sort of museum through which you pass through different periods of time. This is where he's finding a certain amount of value, the shift and the control of time, right? By decorating your rooms a certain way, it's as though you control different periods of time. One of the most famous and amazing passages in this entire book appears at this point. I've got a man in England who buys me clothes. He sends over a selection of things at the beginning of each season, spring and fall. He took out a pile of shirts and began throwing them, one by one before us. Shirts of sheer linen and thick silk, and fine flannel, which lost their folds as they fell and covered the table in many-colored disarray. While we admired, he brought more, and the soft, rich heap mounted higher. Shirts with stripes and scrolls and plaids and coral, and apple green and lavender and faint orange with monograms of Indian blue. Suddenly, with a strained sound, Daisy bent her head into the shirts and began to cry stormily. "They're such beautiful shirts," she sobbed, her voice muffled in the thick folds. "It makes me sad because I've never seen such beautiful shirts before." The two short paragraphs that frame the shirt scene emphasize this idea of control of time. Gatsby has these shirts shipped in at regular intervals. At the end of the third paragraph here, Daisy says she's never seen such. But in between, we have this paragraph of sheer genius. And I just want to unpack a few things. Notice how we go from sheer linen to thick silk, that repetition of that hard K sound. Fine flannel gives us alliteration, as does folds, fall. And everything just then starts to accumulate. Shirts with stripes and scrolls, plaids and coral, apple green, lavender, and faint orange. This is a very bright scene. It's very colorful. Everything's a little bit out of control, and it creates an enormous amount of strain on Daisy. This is a bonus question at this point if you're actually watching the video. What you can respond to on the forum is an answer to this question. What is Daisy crying over? If you choose to answer this question, I know you will have watched this video and have seen this secret question. Some things that I'm not going to talk about are big events in this video, in this chapter. We have the hints about Gatsby's money. Where does it come from? What's it for? The Gatsby and Daisy kiss at the end, right? We ended chapter 4 with a kiss, and now Nick leaves Gatsby and Daisy kissing. This whole idea of Dan Cody and a different part of the past of Gatsby. Don't worry, we'll definitely come to that in a future chapter. But Klipspringer, he also reminds us of this idea of time. I was asleep. That is, I'd been asleep. Further, in the last few pages of this chapter, we have two uses of the word colossus or colossal. And if you look this up, it'll be very interesting to you, I think, because this is also a classical allusion. The Colossus is a very specific reference that those of you that have engaged with certain comics and superhero movies, you'll know Colossus as a hero, but the word is actually very specifically rooted in a meaning that has to do with control. So if any of you pursue that, I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts. So just a few follow-ups on the forum. A critical question. What do you think Gatsby is trying to control in this chapter? A personal question. How has your own relationship with time changed since entering lockdown? And another personal question. At this point, what are your opinions about Gatsby? Why do you feel how you feel? And if you can think of certain specific moments or interactions to help us understand where you're coming from, that would be very valuable. I hope you've enjoyed this quite brief video. I tried to be more succinct as we moved through it in order to just give you a sense of the richness of pursuing one very specific image or motif, right? A recurrent idea that we have. All right. Enjoy chapter 5, and I will see you again on Monday for another poetry video, or it might actually be something different. We'll see if I surprise you.